Yeah, let me immediately start. So the topic of my presentation and my paper is, or the question I ask is whether there are strong forms of minority co-determination in Renner's reform plan. And so happily I don't need to introduce Karl Renner, one of the main, or perhaps the main intellectual fathers of non-territorial autonomy. So I'll dive straight into it. So my answer to this question is yes, and my whole paper consists of arguing for this answer. So when we look, so I should also say that Renner allows for both self-determination, minority self-determination and minority co-determination. So the minority self-determination is this, the minority making its own policy, mostly at first sight only on educational and cultural affairs, through these non-territorially organized national councils. And minority co-determination is, in Renner, the minority participating qua minority in the policy making on other affairs at the central level, the federal level. So when it comes to minority co-determination in Renner, there is a sort of duality. So when you read Renner's texts, when you listen to the spirit of his texts, when you read his rhetorics, then it seems as if Renner gives quite a lot to the minorities. So he speaks of the minorities as being the federal people, so implying this sort of federal constitutive role of the minority nations. He at a certain point says something like, well, the minority nations, they make the decision on the federal order, what kind of federal order it is. So they push the federal state in either more centralistic or more decentralized, a more federal or a more centralized direction. So this is the rhetorics of Renner, and question is to what extent is this rhetorics? And so on the other hand, and hence this duality, on the other hand, when we ask Renner, so where are the institutions in your reform plan that should implement this, this strong form of co-determination, then we get a much more minimal picture. So I could give other examples, but I'll get straight to the point. When you say minority co-determination, then I think a lot of us think about minority delegates and minority veto in the main legislative chamber of the Federation. In Renner's reform plan, this would be the federal parliament. So Renner is minimal qua institutions for minority co-determination because it doesn't allow for minority delegations, neither for a minority veto in the federal parliament. So hence this duality. On one hand, Renner's rhetorics. On the other hand, where are the institutions in Renner's reform plan? And this duality, this difficulty is further compounded by the fact that you can make two readings of Karl Renner, of his reform plan, and of his position vis-à-vis minority co-determination. The first reading is that Renner is simply a German nationalist, that he writes for the greater glory of the German people, that he wants to preserve this bigger Habsburg Empire that is German-dominated, and that he wants to strengthen the central government of this German-dominated empire, and so also this German-dominated central government. And hence, so this would explain this centrism in Renner, this lack of strong institutions of minority co-determination. So if you make this reading, so why do I say this in my introduction? Well, if you make this reading of Renner, then you tend to go for putting the emphasis on the first part of the duality. So then you see Renner's rhetorics about giving a lot to the minority nations as being just that, rhetorics, as being boasting, as being a cunning way to undercut the position of the minorities. Now, there is a second reading possible of Renner, and that is that his centrism is informed by his Marxism, or is caused by his Marxism. And so in this reading, Renner is one of those Marxists who likes bigger economic units, strongly, quickly economically developing economic units, and that this is the reason why he is in favor of maintaining the Habsburg Empire, a big economic unit, and strengthening the central government, the government which back then or could be associated with strong economic development. So I answer the question, are there strong forms of minority co-determination in Renner's plan positively. I say yes, but I have this difficulty that he doesn't allow for strong forms in the federal parliament, what you would first look at when you think about strong forms of minority co-determination. And I make this Marxist reading of Renner. So I make this Marxist reading in order to then be able to look at Renner's rhetorics and take him a bit more seriously here. So I read this rhetorics that Renner uses and I think, okay, wait, we have to take a second look at this and maybe it's not only rhetorics. So that's what I do in the first section of my paper and presentation. I just presented this Marxist version of an argument against strong forms of co-determination in the federal parliament. So that's the first section. The second section, I point out the form of strong co-determination that Renner then does allow for outside of the federal parliament. And then in the third section, I offer a few conclusions. So what is Renner's Marxist, nationally neutral argument against strong forms of co-determination in the federal parliament? Well, to understand this, we have to understand a bit Renner's theory of democracy. And his theory of democracy is interesting because it is surprisingly modern. And why is it modern? Well, it is based on a cleavage or a form of cleavage theory of democracy. So cleavages are, of course, these large cuts through society, these big fault lines through society. And Renner has also such a cleavage theory. He gives a few examples of such cleavages. For him, urban-rural divide is an example. Of course, the proletarian-bourgeois divide is another example. And so a bit differently from the standard cleavage theory of Lipset and Entan, for Renner, these cleavages stack on top of each other. So they all more or less make the same cut in society. And so what you end up with is two blocks in society, and rather importantly, I just said more or less the same cuts in society, because these two blocks have rough edges. There are some fluid borders between those two blocks. And so if this was the sociology of democracy that Renner offered, then there is a political theory of democracy that corresponds to this. And you can already guess this political theory or this sociology completely legitimizes, even further legitimizes than the standard cleavage theory, this majoritarian American style of democracy. So the two big blocks in society would correspond to two major parties. And these two major parties then compete over the floating voters that correspond to these fluid edges surrounding the blocks. And this process of competition, the two major parties competing over the floating voters, that is for Renner, and this is not only a description, but also for Renner normative, that is how a democracy functions properly. And notice that this is a Marxist argument in a way that it is based on socioeconomic changes. So a way to describe this competition over floating voters is as a sort of changing socioeconomic alliances. Changing alliances, changing factional alliances that form these two major parties. So coming to the federal parliament, why is there no room for minority co-determination in the federal parliament, according to Renner? Well, Renner wants to put this process of changing socioeconomic alliances, this process of competition over floating voters, he wants to put it center stage. And the federal parliament is the parliament in which it should be put center stage. So he, at a certain point, explicitly says the federal parliament is the unifying organ par excellence of the federal order. It has the job to put this process center stage. Why does this go against strong forms of minority co-determination? Well, take, for example, minority delegates. Renner says this process of changing socioeconomic alliances, of competition, this has to be completely free. And strong forms of minority co-determination would hamper it, would make it unfree. And when Renner says completely free, he means not hampered by national, ethnic, religious affiliation, but purely based on these socioeconomic facts, the socioeconomic changing alliances. So to make it more concrete, take the example of a farmer who used to be who is a minority member, and he used to be firmly into the camp of the bourgeois bloc before. But now things are changing, times are changing, and the position of this farmer, when you socioeconomically describe him, he now belongs to the the proletarian bloc, or he would be more in line with the proletarian policies. Now Renner says, well, this farmer should soberly assess his situation and just make the change to the proletarian bloc. And this is when this farmer now has a national affiliation, which is a bit too strong. Well, suppose that the farmer is not only a farmer, but also a member of parliament, and not only that, but also a minority delegate. Suppose that this farmer has a bit of a national affiliation, then it already hampers this process. So suppose that the farmer is a minority delegate, then he has this official formal duty to represent the rest of his nation, which, if the rest of his nation is, for example, more bourgeois, also hampers his shift to the proletarian party. Okay, take it or leave it. This is more or less, or the basis or the core of Renner's argument for leaving strong forms of minority co-determination outside of the federal parliament. What to do with it? Well, in any case, it's not an argument that has a premise for the greater glory of the German nation. It's not a German nationalist argument. It's a Marxist argument. So I take this to be an indication that Renner is not cunningly trying to undercut the minority nations. No, Renner is sincere in his belief that this is how a federal parliament should work. And I think we can go even a step further. Renner is sincere in thinking that this is how a federal parliament should work. And he sees now that he has a problem. He leaves out minority co-determination outside of the realm of power, the basis of power of the federation, outside of the federal parliament. And now he cannot give the minorities that much anymore. So, and this is, I think, a good way of reading Renner, of understanding his reform plan. He tries to prop up the other ways in which he still can give things to the minority nations. And so let us look at one of those, perhaps the most important of those ways in which he tries to prop up minority co-determination, which brings me to my second section. And in order to understand this strong form of co-determination that Renner does leave, it is important to understand that Renner does not offer a finished constitution in his reform plan, but rather much more a constitutional framework. And you can see this framework aspect in Renner's reform plan in a lot of elements of this reform plan. So to give a few examples, there is, for example, room of maneuver that Renner leaves in, for example, the division of powers. So if you look at this list of division of powers he makes, it's rather minimal. It leaves a lot of things undecided. It's rather abstract. And Renner at a certain point explicitly says, well, the point is that future generations will fill in the gaps. And the same holds for the role of the Kreise, so these very important, to Renner, very important local subunits of self-government. They are very important to Renner, he mentions them a lot, but he remains quite silent about the legislative role of these Kreise. So also something that can be filled in later on. I think we can generalize this point about the Renner offering a framework of a constitution rather than a finished constitution. What Renner in many ways is simply doing in his reform plan is he is standardizing and facilitating a practice that was going on in the Habsburg Empire. And that is the practice of national compromises. Now, when I say compromise, then the German translation for this is Ausgleich. And that makes us think, of course, immediately towards the Hungarian Ausgleich in the 19th century. Now, what is not so well known is that there were many more Ausgleiche than just the Hungarian Ausgleich. So in almost all the multicultural, heterogeneous crownlands, these subunits of the empire, there were at least attempts at an Ausgleich. So you had one in Moravia, which famously implemented Renner to some extent. You had one also in Bukovina. You even had a couple of failed attempts in Bohemia. So Renner sees this practice of national compromises, of Ausgleiche, and he very much tries to facilitate it in his reform plan. Of course, the point, and now I I put my finger on where the minority co-determination is. Well, the point of a national compromise is, of course, that it is a compromise between nations. So it is the nations coming together and giving further shape to further filling out the framework that Renner offers. And this is a form of minority co-determination. It is the nations that determine to a large extent the compromise. And these compromises were, there would not be a final compromise, but the nations would always give further shape to these compromises.
Piet, sorry to interrupt. I don't have other means to give you an indication discreetly. So could you please just spend 2 more minutes for the conclusions? Thank you.
Yeah, I was about to go to the conclusion. Well, to say one last thing, one thing to notice about this way of proceeding is that co-determination is blanked from sight in a way. So once the compromise has been made, things are moved either into onto the federal level and are done in a unified way. So in the federal parliament, which operates in a unified way. And the things that the nations decide to do on themselves would fall under the category of self-determination in Renner. Okay, so I'll drop one conclusion, which is perhaps a pity because it would be about in which way this could be put into a right to co-determination, which I haven't mentioned yet. But let me make the other conclusion quickly, which is that you can still make the German nationalist reading here. So this whole story about Renner offering just a framework, there are still indications to think that Renner had cunningly had in mind a framework that would skew the whole federation into the direction of a centralized federation rather than a more decentralized federation. In a way, what I'm thinking about here is this role of the Kreise is a sort of divide and conquer game or you could read it as a sort of divide and conquer game that Renner plays with the minority nations. So I'll conclude here, and many thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Piet. Let's move to questions for Piet, please. Yes, we've got one over there. Just speak loudly so Piet can hear you as well. Yeah.
Hi, Piet. Thank you. Good to see you. Unfortunately, you're not here, and I had difficulties in understanding your entire presentation for technical reasons, so I tried to listen to you and to read your abstract, and I have a question. It's more a philosophical, terminological question. What you describe, I totally agree. So Renner's attempt to bring the nationalities into the state, but what is for you is the difference than what you describe as co-determination and, sorry, I can't pronounce this word, but consociationalism. So I think where do you make this difference? And just one little remark, I would strongly recommend not to use the term minority for the Habsburg Empire. And Renner never talks about minorities, he always talks about the nationalities. And I think this makes a big difference. We are in an empire.
Okay, Piet, did you get the question? Yep.
Yeah,
please
loud
respond.
And clear. So thank you, Boris. That is a good question. So the difference between co-determination and consociationalism. At the end of my paper, I say a bit about it, and I think it is what Renner very much tries to do, consociationalism without, I say minorities again, to translate it to the contemporary lingo, but without national parties, is, to put it into the Renner lingo, is almost impossible, I think. Consociationalism needs national parties, and Renner very much tries to prevent national parties from emerging, from becoming strong. So in a way, what Renner tries to do is to give the role that the national parties have, also legitimately have in a multinational federation, namely preventing that strong forms of centralization occur, that the central government takes everything in its own hand. So the legitimate role of national or minority parties. Renner puts this role of these minority parties and takes this role and puts it into the hand of the national councils. And so this would be the start of my answer to your question. But it really goes to the point. There are much more things that you could say here. And your point about minorities, not talking about minorities, is a very good one. And indeed, the context in the Habsburg Empire is completely different. It's almost much more like European Union and nations in the European Union, rather than the situation in many countries that are being talked about here today, also in the conference.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other question for Piet? Okay, I don't think we've got another question, so thank you very much again, Piet. A round of applause for you.